Good morning. I am Tim Hartwig, and it's my privilege to serve at Bethany Lutheran Theological Seminary. On behalf of the Reformation Lecture Committee, Bethany Lutheran College, and Bethany Lutheran Theological Seminary, I would like to welcome everyone to the 2024 Bjarne W Teigen Reformation Lectures. During your time here at Bethany, you're invited to get to know our beautiful campus. Please don't forget to visit the ELS Museum and the seminary. Becky DeGamo will be at the museum today at 12:45 to answer questions and guide you through the museum. Feel free to visit the seminary in any of the breaks. If you would like a guided tour of the seminary, please speak to me and I can arrange a guide for you. This is the 56th Annual Reformation Lectures. If you look at the list of past speakers, you will see a diversity of lecturers from many of the branches of Lutheranism today, beginning with Hermann Sasse in 1965. The purpose of these lectures is to increase an interest in and knowledge of the Reformation period and the application of Reformation theology for today. Justification by grace alone through faith in Jesus Christ alone is the heart and center of the Reformation, Lutheran Reformation, and its theology. It continues to be the article upon which the church stands or falls, and therefore it remains as the heart and center of the church today. Just as the old evil foe fought against Martin Luther and the Reformers, he continues to attack the church today so that the gospel in word and sacrament might be lost again. We belong to a church militant. This year's lecture series is focused on the 50th anniversary of Seminex. On February 19, 1974, the faculty and students walked out of Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, and became Seminex, the seminary in exile. You could view the walkout as a volcano erupting. For decades, almost imperceptible forces were working under the surface. The eruption makes those forces visible for all. What were those forces in the case of Seminex? To name just three: the historical critical method or higher criticism, gospel reductionism, and ecumenism. Those three forces put the heart of the church at risk by attacking the doctrine of justification by faith alone in Jesus Christ alone. Just as it took years for those forces to build and to work out, it will also take years for the effect of the walkout to subside. Seminex in many ways was a relief for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, but the church is still suffering from the effects 50 years later. The three lecturers will present on the impact and perspective of Seminex from their own synod's perspective. President Matt Harrison will speak to the impact on Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Dr. Mark Brown will give the Wisconsin Evangelical Synod perspective, and President Glenn Obenberger will address the impact and perspective of Seminex from the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. After my introduction, we will immediately begin the first lecture. The second lecture will be at 2 p.m. this afternoon. The third lecture will be at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. An open discussion of all three lectures will take place at 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. There will be time for discussion after each lecture, but Friday afternoon is especially dedicated to fielding questions from the audience. The format of these lectures is that of a free conference, and thus the lectures are outside of the framework of fellowship. With this in mind, we urge everyone to participate in the discussion. Finally, the 3 essays are being recorded and will be available via the college and seminary websites. They will also be published in the March issue of the seminary's Lutheran Synod Quarterly. All this information and more is available to you in the trifolds you received with the opening lecture. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first lecturer, President Matthew Harrison. The Reverend Dr. Matthew C. Harrison has served as President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod since 2010. As President, he is the Chief Ecclesiastical Supervisor of the Synod and is responsible for the national program ministries of the LCMS, including the Office of International Mission, which calls and employs some 150 missionaries globally. Before becoming president, Harrison served for 9 years as Executive Director of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, World Relief and Human Care. During that time, LCMS, World Relief and Human Care, coordinated the $14 million dollar response to Hurricane Katrina and the multi-million-dollar responses to the tsunami in Asia and the earthquake in Haiti. Manage relationships with some 120 LCMS recognized service organizations and other inter-Lutheran social ministry organizations. Worked in consultation with LCMS partner churches to build capacity during numerous mercy outreach efforts and manage LCMS pro-life efforts. A native of Sioux City, Iowa, Harrison holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies from Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa, and an MDiv and STM from Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne. Harrison has pursued additional graduate study at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, and has received honorary doctorates from Concordia University, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the seminary in Fort Wayne. Harrison has written, translated, and edited a number of books, including Christ Have Mercy, A Little Book on Joy, At Home in the House of My Fathers, The Church and the Office of the Ministry by LCMS founder C.F.W. Walther, and 5 volumes of essays and letters of Lutheran theologian Hermann Sasse, including The Lonely Way and Letters to Lutheran Pastors. Harrison also serves as chairman of the board of the International Lutheran Society of Wittenberg, which hosts some 40 students and church planners from the European Union and beyond, who are studying to become ordained pastors. In addition, Harrison chairs the board of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty and serves on the executive committee of the International Lutheran Council. Harrison is active in the pro-life movement and frequently speaks at such events. He was one of a select group of pro-life leaders asked to take part in the DC March for Life during the COVID-19 lockdown. Harrison and his wife Kathy live in Baldwin, Missouri, and are members of Village Lutheran Church in Ladue, Missouri, where he also serves as assistant pastor. They have 2 married sons and 1 granddaughter. Harrison is an avid bluegrass banjo player and builder of guitars, banjos, and mandolins, as well as a vintage Jeep enthusiast. Please welcome President Matthew Harrison.
Well, when they asked the 3 Synod presidents if they would speak on this topic, I think we all said, especially Schrader and I said, that okay, but we can't, I don't have time to prepare a formal paper for this thing. I just don't. And they said, okay, just come, whatever, it's going to be okay. And then Schrader bails on us. And what do we get? We get Braun coming here with a formal paper with footnotes and everything. So anyway, I've scribbled some notes and some thoughts. Hopefully they aren't too disjointed for you. But this is a very difficult topic to speak on for many reasons. Fundamentally, the entire Seminex movement, in fact, the entire, certainly at least post-war movement of the Missouri Synod toward one Lutheran church in America was a gross mistake and failure. And it was the most costly failure in the history of the Missouri Synod. I was just told by a panelist up here that our book from the Concordia Historical Institute on the walkout is triumphalism, according to somebody in the ELCA. Well, I disagree with that, of course. But the whole event has shaken us to our foundations and eliminated, I think, all but eliminated Missouri Synod triumphalism. As Larry Rass points out, there was nothing the Missouri Synod could do after the war, really, but after 1950 that was wrong because everything was working. They projected in 1960 that by 1980 or 90, the Missouri Synod would have 8 million people. Things were going so magnificently. Then you had a little something called the sexual revolution, the drop of the birth rate in half and then in half again. And things looked much different. The preface to the Book of Concord said, the signers of the Book of Concord in the preface asserted that the task before them were alles das zu tun und fortzusetzen, was zu Vermehrung und Ausbreiten Gottes Lob und Ehren. To do everything to advance and increase and spread God's praise and honor. Und zu seines allein selig machenden Worts Fortzupflanzung. And to advance alone the saving Word of God. Zu Ruhe und Friede christlicher Schulen und Kirchen. To the peace and tranquility of Christian schools and churches. Auch zu notwendigem Trost und Unterricht der Arme verwirrten Gewissen. To console confused consciences. The entire Seminex movement and the Missouri Synod failed grossly at every one of those points. Little did I know, I noticed when we all talk about this, and Professor Braun's paper will also highlight this, you can't help but think about where you were. When Seminex occurred, I was a 12-year-old in Sioux City, Iowa, riding my bicycle and generally having a good time in life, completely oblivious to anything and everything. I officially got a religious studies major at Concordia College, or at Morningside College, a Methodist school in Sioux City, but I really majored in football. It was in 1984 that I went to Seward. I had begged the Methodists to let me finish my degree at Seward, and they finally let me go. So I could get some Greek. I had decided to go to the seminary. And that's the first time I recall hearing about Seminex or the name Ralph Bowman or anybody else. Little did I know at the time that the effects of Seminex would shape the entire rest of my life, daily and intensely. and they still do. I was talking to Bill Weinrich, prof at our Fort Wayne Seminary, a year or so ago, and he told me a story. He was the grad assistant to Martin Charlemagne. This was around 1970 in St. Louis at the seminary. And some of the professors had invited several leaders of the Black Panthers to the seminary campus in St. Louis. And Bill told it vividly. He remembered. They drove up in a yellow Cadillac convertible, parked under the Martin Luther statue, and Seek Hall was packed with students and faculty, and they began showing films of themselves disrupting court proceedings in Chicago and causing general havoc and chaos. And at the end of their presentation, and forgive me for this depiction, especially in this space, I hope you're not offended, but I think I must tell it. At the end of their presentation, they raised the black power fist and started shouting, F you, F you, F you, F you, F you, marching out to the rousing approval of the great majority of faculty and students. Bill said, you cannot imagine how radical that institution was. And anti-institutional. I said, well, Bill, how come you did not share in that anti-institutional fervor? He gave me the name of an author, which escapes me at the moment. I'll remember it tonight when I'm in bed. But he had read a book especially which talked about the humanizing force of institutions for achieving human good. That was a generation, and forgive me, I know many of you were there. One can't get through a discussion like this without some generalizations. But it was an era that did not build institutions, it was an era that was tearing down institutions. And certainly destroying the past. Hermann Zasse said, and it burns in my mind, watch out when the fathers of the church are no longer regarded with veneration. It's the surest sign of demise in the church. A friend of mine told me, he was there in the isolation dorm, that there were clouds, in his words, of blue pot smoke regularly emanating from the dorm. It was radical. Robert Price talked about Charlemagne coming in the 1950s to the seminary, and Charlemagne, the great military general. But Charlemagne spoke at the 1957 fall faculty forum of the seminary and asserted something like, the Bible, which is inerrant for all matters of faith and life, contains errors. And things began to change radically. It's true, and I think Marquardt is right, ecclesiology is the driving issue which gets Missouri off kilter, certainly pre-war, but certainly post-war. Ecumenism, coming out of the ghetto, rubbing shoulders with Europeans. We'll talk about some of that. Robert joked, and he said, Charlemagne was the guy who led them all right up to the cliff, and he stopped, and like buffalo, they all went over. Charlemagne was heavily influenced by Zasse, first speaker for this event. It's a bit of a surprise that Zasa was invited in 65 here, given the fact that the Wells had been publishing his letters to Lutheran pastors when they first came out in translation from 1947, 48 or so, until the letter, I think, letter 14 on the Scriptures, where Zasa denies absolute inerrancy. Zasa ends up in the strange position of, having a real Adam and Eve and a real fall in a mythical garden, much as I respect him. But Zasa had gone to school at University of Berlin, the greatest university in history, at the time, the greatest university in the world. He studied under the greatest lights of scholarship, mostly liberal scholarship at the time, whether Adolf Deismann, a great investigator of ancient papyri, whether Adolf von Harnack, who was the greatest historian of dogma, who denied all dogma, basically. Harnack's own father read his History of Dogma for the first time and said, "I don't know that I see anything of a Christian theologian in these pages." Zasa was never a big-time liberal. He always believed in the basic stories of the Scriptures, the miracles of Jesus, the incarnation, etc. But he said, we went into the trenches of World War I. He was a chaplain of World War I. We went into the trenches reading Pindar and Sophocles and came out with our Greek New Testaments. And he participated from the beginning in the Luther revival with Karl Hull, also at the University of Berlin. It was after the war that he came to the United States in 1926-27 and wrote Amerikanisches Kirchentum, and the American churchdom, but he came into contact with Lutherans in America, particularly in the LCA. He was from the Prussian Union Church, and he came into contact with these American Lutherans and discovered, he said, what Lutheranism really was. He read the Confessions, he read Willem Leah's 3 books on the church, and that's when he says he really became a Lutheran and went back and began advocating for Orthodox Lutheranism and against the union of Lutheran and Reformed, which finally won the day in all of Germany. He moved tremendously from Harnack to teaching at Erlangen to dear friend of the Missouri Synod to lecturer at this founding event 65 years ago. But he never came all the way. Interestingly, Charlemagne apologized for his position on the Scriptures after causing much consternation at the convention in 62 or 63, if I recall. However, a couple of years ago, CHI Harmelink, who's here, sent me a document from Charlemagne files where Charlemagne wrote to Zasa a letter that actually, while it was on the way to Zasa died in Adelaide. Charlemagne said, if these guys, mind you, this is after the walkout, 1976, Charlemagne says, if these guys knew my real position on Scripture, they would hang me. You alone, Dr. Zasa, have understood the issues in the case. Zasa was wrong on inerrancy. You can see several of my books on that issue in the Letters to Lutheran Pastors footnotes. But things were moving very quickly in St. Louis. Bill Hecht, who was the dean of Republican lobbyists in D.C., died a couple of years ago, was trained, probably the same class as David Scare, for those of you who are unfortunate enough to know him. In the late 50s, Hecht started the campus ministry at the University of Oklahoma, from which Bill Weinrich emerged. By the way, that entire vibrant campus ministry with its building that Heck built was all lost to Seminex. Bill was at the seminary, and he was learning from a former Wellesian. Remember, we had several Wellesians who helped us go right over the cliff. One was Alfred von Rohr-Sauer, teacher of Old Testament. Von Rohr-Sauer was lecturing on multiple Isaiahs, compatible with critical theory and denying prophecy in various ways in Isaiah. Bill Heck raised his hand, stood up, and gave a rousing advocacy for a united Isaiah. When he was done, von Rohr-Sauer asked him, "Mr. Heck, that was very well done. Where did you learn that?" And Heck said, "Last year in your isagogics class." By the way, there's a tantalizing tale. After the walkout, there was a wedding involving a Missourian family and a walkout family, I think, at Valparaiso University in the early 80s. John Pless was present. And by that time, von Rohr-Sauer had grown his hair quite long, his long, white, stringy hair, and he leaned over the fondue and caught fire. To which Pless quickly said, "Look, a flaming liberal." That will deserve a footnote in the printed version. The war and quest for the fellowship with the ALC were heavy on the agenda in Missouri. You had fine men like Michael Roy at the Iowa Synod and the old ALC. Roy, who wrote a famous piece on the inerrancy of the scriptures as confessed by Luther. It's a fantastic document. He had some of the Iowa Synod chiliastic views and a few other things on the open questions that had existed prior to that for those of you who studied. But Roy's genuine Lutheranism, Luther scholarship, and sacramental correctness was, of course, attractive. During the war, there was mutual aid, the founding of Lutheran World Relief, the founding of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, these serving Europeans, largely European Lutherans, being assisted by Lutherans in America. Post-war came LaCusa, Lutheran Church USA, and constant interaction between them. Zasa was invited to come to St. Louis in 1948. What happened was that Zasa had lost favor, had a nervous breakdown as pro-rector, clean of Nazism, pro-rector of the University of Erlangen, and he quipped one time that after he had a nervous breakdown at the Nuremberg, I think it was the Munich or Nuremberg, probably the Munich train station, he was sent to the sanitarium for a month, and the doctor told him that he would never work again, which he chuckled about. But he came to St. Louis in 1948. It's just this point that Missouri is feeling its strength. The Bod Bowl meetings had begun. These were meetings between Missouri theologians and some other American theologians and Lutherans in Europe, like Werner Ehlert and Paul Althaus and others. Werner Ehlert, great influence for good in general, but also denies the inerrancy of the Bible. Of course, none of them believed in the inerrancy of the Bible. None of them were straight on the historicity of Genesis. And there were other issues that were going along there too. The Missourians naively thought they were having a huge influence on German Lutheranism. What was happening at the same time was the formation of the EKID, the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland, EKID. And that was a union church of the various Reformed, United, and Lutheran churches in Germany. Already in 1817, the Prussian king forced a union in Prussia, 7,000 Lutheran churches forced to unite with 24 Reformed churches. No longer two different confessions, no longer closed communion, but now unity in the true spirit of the Reformers. The Prussians also, in the Treaty of Versailles, took Wittenberg and Sachsen-Anhalt. So when you go to Wittenberg today and you go in front, it's a magnificent town. We should thank those people for upholding it and keeping the monuments, the churches beautiful and letting us use them. Make no mistake, when you go there today in front of the town hall and you see Luther's statue, go around the back and you'll see that statue was dedicated by Friedrich Wilhelm III, whom Zasse tells how he first unites the two churches, forces the union, and the next day goes down to Wittenberg to dwell near the spirit and feel the spirit of Luther. It's Schwarmgeisterei. Totally. Prussia gains power through the 19th century. Church after church falls, state after state in Germany falls to Prussia's influence, and the union expands. There are some churches that were intact. There were 11 intact, or 11 Lutheran churches that still, through the 19th century, retain much of their identity and their confessional subscription. However, there had been several different unions along the way. Hitler forced one in 1933 in Wittenberg. After the war, Zasse thought, now we have a chance to have a Lutheran government of Lutheran churches. We can do cooperation in externals with non-Lutherans or united churches, but we can have our own Lutheran governance for Lutheran churches. His efforts failed. EKID was formed. Today, it is the purveyor universally of sexual deviance, of theological chaos. And even the most mild of theologians among us, a friend who knows the German situation better than anybody I know, told me, it is unbelievable how far they have fallen. In Luther's own church, you have a lesbian ELCA clergy couple regularly leading worship in the daily worship. Well, Zasse's own Bavarian church went into the Union. Just at this point, the Missourians are saying, there's hope here. We Missourians have a tendency to get on the bandwagon when it's already 20 years old and heading in the wrong direction, clearly. So much so that when Hans Lilje, bishop of the Hanoverian church, still with a Lutheran confession, when the pastorate was asked to vote on whether they would join the EKID, the first vote failed. And he asked the press to leave. He pulled out a letter from an older Missourian who said, based on his Congregationalist belief in the church, that there can be nothing to prevent you, Hanover, from joining the EKD. That older Missourian was Theodor Grebner. Hans Lilje asked the pastorate, do you wish to be more Missourian than the Missourians? They voted again and joined the Union with the help of Missouri. Benken had thought Zasse would be helpful in St. Louis. Zasse was good on all the ecumenical issues, the fellowship issues, the confession issues, the nature of the Book of Concord. He invites him. Zasa meets a totally cold shoulder. Old Fearbringer had died in 43, nephew of Walther. Zeke had followed him. His entire goal, a local parish pastor, his entire goal was Lutheran Union at the institution during his presidency, which continued with the younger Fearbringer. And Zasa writes in 48, "I see black for this church." He's told by Zeke, do not get involved in any synodical conference controversies, given the cold shoulder. And then finally leaves town. He's chosen to be prof in Australia in 1949. He goes to Australia, and he immediately joins the Intersynodical Committee, 2 Lutheran churches in Australia, both from Prussia, one more attached to Neuendettelsau, ALC, Dubuque, the other Missouri. Same issues that differentiated them. Zasa brings a blast of confessionalism to the Uelka side of the church, the Neuendettelsau German side, to which he comes as professor. But for his investing in that kind of theological improvement, it is unlikely that the union ever would have occurred. However, Zasa, everybody knew, did not believe in absolute inerrancy. And so when the documents came out preparatory to the union asserting inerrancy, there remained a question, including the first president of the Lutheran Church of Australia himself, Les Grope. I have a book of his, Robert Preuss's dissertation on the dogmaticians and the nature of the Bible. I've got a note in there from Grope asserting that the Bible does contain errors under his signature. So that church in 1965 starts out with a questionable confession on the nature of the Scriptures. It's my contention that the Lutheran Church of Australia would not have been able to be formed with questionable starting point unless St. Louis had already gone completely wobbly. Another affected loss of Seminex. Young men were sent to study in St. Louis in the 50s and 60s from Australia. And by the way, from all of our partner churches. And these students, many of them ended up promoting the Lutheran World Federation, promoting women's ordination, and in cases taking their churches out of fellowship with the Missouri Synod, which has happened. What happened in Australia is they agreed to break fellowship with both the Lutheran World Federation, to get out of the Lutheran World Federation on one side, and break fellowship with Missouri on the other side. As a result, the Lutheran Church of Australia was in fellowship with nobody, and therefore in fellowship with everybody. They just voted to ordain women a couple of weeks ago. I feel for my brothers who are still there, confessing. They have decisions to make, but we are supporting Lutheran Mission Australia. It's really, I think, probably fortuitous that Zasa did not come to St. Louis. The Lord was looking over us, as strong as he is on so many wonderful issues. It would have been a problem. Just an aside on Australia, Norman Hobble was part of the walkout. He's still alive in his 90s. But he had at first, because of the influence of Henry Hamann, not been allowed to have any kind of activity in the Lutheran Church of Australia. However, about 15 years ago, probably, maybe more, he was on a finalist list to be principal of the Australian Seminary. And he's written things since, Eco-Bible, Universalism, all kinds of things. He was kind of the first to openly deny the historicity of the first chapters of Genesis, if those of you remember his writings in the early 60s while on the faculty of St. Louis. So a couple of the other candidates who were shoo-ins dropped out. He was the only guy left. I mean, he had the Aussie Rules football, and he was like right there on the goal line, you know? And it was only him left. At that point, several women from the faculty came forward, from faculty assistants, and said, if this guy is elected, we're all quitting because he treats women horribly. Truth is stranger than fiction. The great emancipator. I'll get letters about that one. Of course, the ELS had to break in 55 with Missouri and the Wells in 63. You could not have done otherwise. You would have been dragged through the nightmare that the Missouri Synod experienced. What happened with us, as we found out in our conversations over the last dozen years, which have been the highlight, I think, of my career, but what happened was you, particularly Wells, fortified and extended its understanding of the doctrine of prayer fellowship and fellowship. And what happened with Missouri is Missouri simply forgot the issue altogether. Missouri changed its position on prayer fellowship to some extent, to be sure. Although Marquardt calls the period in the 20s sclerosis, the prelude toward hemorrhage or something like that, where there were some Missourians who were saying things like, we don't have an agreed doctrine on whether churches can have bazaars, so we don't have union. And he argues that there was, that being too tight on some issues pushes ultimately to the other side of things. And I think I generally agree with him. But for Missouri, the issues of prayer fellowship were just forgotten completely. Really, probably until Yankee Stadium event in the Missouri Synod. Since then, thankfully, we had one or two events where people then apologized for action, and we've had very calm. Our district presidents and our pastors are very careful about these civic events. In fact, I've gotten calls just in the last month or two, pastor wanting to take part in an event for such and such, and I usually just tell the DP, he's got the question. I say, let me talk to the CTCR guys, and Leyenbauer had been around a long time, see what they think, just kind of hash it over. And most of the time we get back to them and say, you know, probably not a good idea. Well, we always get back to them and say, not a good idea. Whatever the benefits might be purported to be, you can't control the situation. It's like our pastor who prayed at the Republican National Convention. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that nobody else would be praying on the same stage. And then right before he goes on, he finds out a Hindu is going to come on later on. Something always goes wacky. But we just forgot that issue totally. Let's see. The LaCusa continues through the 60s. There are a number of joint projects going on at the time. There's there's military chaplaincy working in cooperation. There's an agreement to serve conjointly. There are also numerous horror stories from our chaplains who were horribly mistreated. And long past the walkout, into the 90s and even the 2000s, where our own military chaplains who had been trained in the 50s and 60s did not uphold the rights of our own chaplains not to break their ordination vows. John Woolraby and the chaplains, the older chaplains, can tell all of those stories which are so difficult, so painful. Woolraby was this close to being drummed out of the Navy because his supervising LCMS supervisor would not support his confessional conscience and what he had sworn he would abide by. Thankfully, someone intervened. We lost so much. Families were split, destroyed. Virtually almost every, certainly theological or public family in the Missouri Synod has a horror story about how their family was divided over Seminex. We lost 250 congregations, including one or more of our founding 12. We lost the identity of several of our LCMS colleges. And some of those colleges lost that identity and never recovered it. I am very pleased, aside from the challenges we've had with Ann Arbor lately financially, but we are in the best shape with our universities that we have been in 60 years or more, probably much more. The new system for governing the schools is working. Our university presidents are serious about Lutheran identity. Everything is codified, and we're working what the convention gave us to work. And I am so thankful as I meet with the CUS and just hear everything they've been doing on these issues and our university presidents. Thanks be to God. You could say that Concordia, Texas is a casualty of Seminex. When I first was elected president, there was a vacancy at Concordia, Texas. The leadership in the district, that time trained in the era of Seminex, or trained in the era leading up to Seminex, refused to abide by the bylaws and to insist upon them. And they chose a president of that institution, called him a different name, without the president's approval. So what did I do? Do I want a fight with the Texas district right out of the first becoming elected? I thought, no, we'll work with this. We'll make it happen. That individual, of course, led the movement to remove that college, to steal that university from the Missouri Synod, which it has done. It was stolen theologically long before. I maintain that is a loss of Seminex. We had all kinds of challenges with worship and hymnals. If you criticize the new LCMS hymnal, LSB, think of this. And John Vicker just gave a wonderful presentation on this last month somewhere where I was, I don't remember where. But we came into this with a joint predecessor body to the ELCA, joint hymnal, Lutheran, LBW, Lutheran Book of Worship. If you look at that hymnal, it says Missouri Synod and the others in the preface. At the last minute, we had synodical changes in the conventions in the late 60s. And in the last minute, we pulled out of that, re-edited it, and dropped our own hymnal, Lutheran Worship, which has many challenges and deficiencies. Then, of course, we had TLH. So when we went into this new hymnal 15 years ago, we had at least three different hymnals operative in the Missouri Synod. So when you look at Lutheran Service Book, and you see, you want to criticize it or level criticism at its weaknesses, whatever they may be, just think about this. They had to pull together the tradition of churches worshiping with three different hymnals at the same time. And they succeeded to get that hymnal into something like 94% of our congregations. An amazingly costly challenge provided us by the whole era of Seminex. After Lacusa ended, so there weren't a group of Lutheran churches in '87 with the formation of the ELCA, there was just the Committee on Lutheran Cooperation, Missouri Synod, and the ELCA. And we had several things that were going. We had Lutheran World Relief Baltimore, which was defined, I believe, as a ministry of each of the churches together. It's no longer that. It's an independent organization. It hasn't been Lutheran for many decades or anything near it. When I was there on that board for 10 years as part of World Relief, I said many times, I don't want you getting involved in the gospel because you'll get it wrong. The one thing I and Bishop Hansen of the ELCA agreed upon was that LWR should at least help our church bodies globally have capacity to care for people in times of disaster or other crises. That's the only thing we ever agreed on. And he was much more effective at being crabby with the board than I was. But they simply work with non-governmental organizations, and they do a lot of good, but there's no name of Christ anywhere to be found. Hasn't been for many decades. We work together with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. Similar situation there. That is now an independent organization. They do provide assistance from time to time if there's an immigration issue, like a Missouri Synod person marries an illegal immigrant or an undocumented immigrant. That person wants to do right by the government. He's facing a situation where he has to go back to Mexico for 10 years, get in line, etc. They may be able to work some government strings to help that situation out, and they have helped in those situations where you understand there's a desire to be compassionate if possible. However, they did work a lot with agencies, resettling people. Remember the Cambodian boat people and all those? They were in many of our churches. Today, they support very significantly left immigration policies, and we have largely backed away. We backed away from any significant participation at all. We had Lutheran disaster response jointly with the ELCA until my tenure. We were into it some years. The entire disaster effort of the Missouri Synod consisted of this. We sent money to Chicago, and Chicago sent that money to social ministry agencies, which did casework among affected families, and fine work for what it was. However, they would not allow us any administration, even though we had the vice presidency of that organization. So I began to tell the ELCA, was it Rebecca Larson who had led the sex study in '92? I began to tell her, no remuneration without administration. And so they did not get the message. Well, they got the message but refused to change. And so we stopped sending money to the ELCA. And we turned especially toward recognizing and increasing Missouri Synod capacity for good things. And there are many, many wonderful things that have happened since. I'll just mention one that I'm very proud of. We have the only chainsaw manual that's ever gone through doctrinal review. Or the only chainsaw manual ever approved by a national denomination in the history of the universe. And it is a confessionally Lutheran chainsaw manual. We lost many institutions. Fort Wayne Lutheran Hospital, in the wobbly years, they allowed the ELCA predecessor bodies to come into the hospital association. By the time the hospital was sold, and they sold the name Lutheran, you drive by Fort Wayne and you see Lutheran Hospital. There's not one shred of Lutheranism about any of it. It's probably good advertising for us. But they sold the name, and by the time they sold it, one ELCA congregation in Fort Wayne had the majority of board members on that board. The foundation was founded. Initially, it gave grants to a gay lesbian dance. This is in the 90s already. The two grant advisors, one was ELCA at the church that left the Synod across the street from our seminary, Gethsemane, and the other was down at Peace, both of them very strong supporters of the theology that had emanated from the Seminex period. It's only been in the recent couple of years that we have new leadership at the foundation, which reflects the 2-to-1 dominance of Missouri Synod congregations and the board, and they've started to fund actual things that have a lot more to do with the gospel. We lost international schools. We lost social ministry agencies. When I came to LCMS World Relief and Human Care, under Al Berry, the board of directors, and Al Berry had a hard time, much harder than I've had, but under Al Berry, the board of directors of Synod had approved a policy whereby my staff on World Relief and Human Care could go to either ELCA or Missouri Synod old folks' homes or social ministry agencies and say, you're affiliated with the ELCA, would you like to be affiliated with the Missouri Synod? Or vice versa. And either both the ELCA and the Missouri Synod rep could do the same each way. Well, what does that entail? Nothing. You've already been approved for the ELCA, so you can be approved for the Missouri Synod. Can you believe that? My employee bragged to me that in his tenure, before I got there, he had managed to get every single social ministry agency, old folks home, etc., in the state of Missouri that was Missouri Synod into a joint relationship with the ELCA. Seminex was costly. And we continue to wind our way out of all that nonsense with diligence, great diligence. It was also costly in its effects long-term on churchmen. I noticed this on the previous generation of the Council of Presidents. Did you know? No, you didn't know this. We had the big Yankee Stadium blow up, which occurred now 20 years ago, was it? And they had never once, as a Council of Presidents, talked about the theology or the event. Under the guise that somebody would have to serve on some adjudication or panel to determine the outcome of a guilty or non-guilty verdict on unionism or something. Can you imagine? They never talked about it once. Biggest upheaval in the Missouri Synod since Seminex. I noticed, and I love these guys, they have many gifts, and I can't make this generalization, but John Kleinig said something very telling. He said, that generation has viewed theology as a negative, controversial thing. And so they tend to not want to talk theology. because it's controversial. I'm a product of post-walkout Fort Wayne. All I do is talk theology. It's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I love theology. I love the Book of Concord. I love the Bible. I just remember going to seminary and having the Bible just pop. There it was. There it was in Greek. And I was reading the same dogma in Pieper. And then I was going to chapel where it all fit together. Theology is everything. I'm happy to say the Council of Presidents today does a exegetical study every meeting, does a confessional study by every meeting. We do other studies every meeting. Those are led by council members themselves. When the issue of the licensed lay reader was very controversial in the Missouri Synod some years ago, and we changed our bylaws on that issue so that those who are actually carrying out the functions of the office on a regular basis need to be ordained. We were having one of our early deep conversations on this issue, well, shallow conversations on this issue on the Council of Presidents, and I listened, and I was reminded of George Wallenberg's saying, well, everything's been said, but not everybody has said it yet. I listened, and after about 45 minutes, I said, we've been talking about the office of the ministry, which is the most significantly studied issue in the history of the Missouri Synod from its founding, and I haven't heard one Bible verse, and I haven't heard one reference to the Lutheran Confessions. And I haven't heard one reference to Luther. We began studying Walther, and we also studied significantly Lieberg, the first part, on Luther, ordination, and office. I'm very happy to say that we have made light years in progress theologically with the Council on this issue and many others. Also, the Seminex period made hardball politics acceptable in the Missouri Synod. I talked to Ralph Bowman numerous times before he died, and I felt somehow that it was and would be the honorable thing to do for me. And I enjoyed those conversations with him. I agreed with him on everything up to Robert Preuss's ouster. And I had to bite my lip on that issue because I was present during that period. I was a grad assistant to Robert. He was my thesis advisor. But Ralph told about coming to the seminary, being invited by the seminary in 1960 or 62 to come and teach. He was a young pastor in Des Moines. And John Bankin, he didn't want to come. He wanted to stay at his pastorate. John Bankin took him around the quad in where the crosses would be placed at Seminex event about 14, 15 years later. John Bankin, president of the Missouri Synod, put his arm around Ralph and said, Ralph, we need what you have at this moment in this place very badly. And that was his confession of the full authority of the Scriptures and the Lutheran Confessions. Ralph's really good book on confessional subscription and the hermeneutics of the Lutheran Confessions was written while he was a student in the late 50s under Robert Preuss. And Robert was so pleased with the book that he went to CPH and said, please publish this wonderful book. Did so. Ralph ended up coming down twice, ended up coming to the seminary. As I talked to him, after he was defeated by Al Berry, there were a number of unfortunate things said. Ralph had spoken ambiguously, if not pro, on women's ordination, as Oliver Harms had after he was unelected in '69 by Jack Preuss challenge. But Ralph never advocated that with me, and he was also, and I found it somewhat surprising, he was intensely opposed to the Seminex movement. He disagreed totally and completely throughout the end of his life with what they had done. And I was happy to hear that. Ralph's challenges, he had personal challenges in the family, a daughter who's married to her lesbian spouse, who's a UCC pastor, with, I think, an adopted child. And Ralph loved his daughter and his grandchild. And so he struggled with that issue. He said, I believe the Missouri Synod is right, but there's got to be some way we can approach it. So he really wrestled big time with that. Ralph said, this is why I bring up Ralph, Ralph said Herman Otten was right to publish those class lectures in the early 60s in his paper because they were public. And I was surprised to hear Ralph say anything positive about Herman whatsoever. But he didn't attack Herman. He just said he was right to do that. And Herman was right to do that. And it's hard to believe that the turnaround in Missouri would have happened without his action in the early 60s. Unfortunately, Herman's reportage became very much problematic through the years. And if, like me, you were subject of his reporting and actually knew what was going on, you recognized that what was reported more often than not had very little to do with what was actually happening or had happened. And that made interaction with Herman very difficult and challenging. So, but there was a lot said, a lot of hard-hitting stuff. And I think Herman had an obsessive-compulsive personality. And I think what happened in the Missouri Synod over those many years of controversy was that certain individuals with obsessive-compulsive personality traits who were willing to step up and blather forth the most outrageous accusations were basically used by either side instead of saying, stop doing that. That's not acceptable. And that caused a lot of consciences to be, I think, hurt in the Missouri Synod. It caused, and the whole issue is a conscience affair. If you check out the Book of Concord, you have the issue of conscience, Gewissen. It occurs, just conscience alone occurs like 400 times in the Book of Concord. It is the kind of human issue at the Reformation. Not to mention the cognates that go with it, like certainty, or which is almost the same word, certainty or consolation. Conscience is so involved because if you don't believe your church's confession, but can't tell people you don't believe your church's confession, that causes the conscience to be seared. This was a problem for the Seminexers because they had been lying prior to the walkout. Yes, we're Lutheran. Yes, nothing has changed. No, we don't believe that. John Pless has shown in his article in the book on Seminex that what happened was after Seminex, they all came out with their radical positions. The conscience also can work very negatively among conservatives. If you're part of a church body that is so horribly affected by false doctrine and controversy, and you, in good conscience, know that you are to associate with a church body that teaches and preaches the truth, it throws you into a conscience difficulty. And I view myself as part of the confessional revival of the Missouri Synod post-Seminex. I work for it every single day of my presidency. I've worked for it every single day of my pastorate for 33 years. The conscience is hurt sometimes. It has been hurt in the past. But we've made progress, amazing, amazing progress. And we can be thankful for that progress. It has been enormous. It is a miracle that the Missouri Synod still exists. An absolute miracle. The issues continued, missiological confusion, one of the, is it Kreshmar brothers? No, Martin, it was in India. From India and our partner church in India, you had kind of radical ecumenism coming out from the LCMS leadership there, which came to infect the mission endeavor in the Missouri Synod. And so in that mission, they became deeply interested in the Union Church of South India. Can you imagine the Missouri Synod having staff promoting the South Indian Union Church of Anglicans and all a bunch of other Protestants? But that's what was happening. Remember, when the guys walked out at Seminex, where did they go to reside right away? Eden Theological Seminary. Eden Theological Seminary is a result of the mission of the Prussian Union, forming the Evangelische Synode des Westens, the Evangelical Synod of the West, which became the Evangelical Christian and Reformed Church, which became the UCC, Eden Seminary. I saw a document not long ago where the students themselves had confessed prior to the walkout that the differences between Calvin and Luther on the Lord's Supper were not significant enough to prevent intercommunion and church fellowship. You must remember that half the faculty at Springfield was pro-walkout or pro-Seminex theology. Half. The internal notes, faculty notes, show the struggles they had internally over those issues. When I was, I talked to a guy from about my era from Fort Wayne, and during his theological interview before being allowed to be certified and placed, you have that interview with theological profs. The question was asked by one prof, closed communion. And the guy said for the entire rest of the interview, the three profs argued different positions in front of him. He never had to say one word for his theological interview. The entire left push of Missouri confused so many pastors who could not discern that the word close is not something different from closed. They may have made something up, but the history of Lutheranism is geschlossen. Franz Pieper wrote, Die apostolische Kirche praktiziert nicht open, sondern closed Kommunion. He even puts it in English for you. But what happened in 1957 in the midst of this? Some clown in editing Pieper's Dogmatics changed it to close. So that issue is a gift that keeps on giving. I mentioned just another one, and then I'll close up. There's an anti-institutionalism that we've inherited from the Seminex era. All you're doing is supporting the institution. Yeah. Let's see. Christ instituted the office of the ministry. Christ instituted the church. Christ instituted the Lord's Supper. Are we against institutions? Are we really about mission, or are we just trying to perpetuate the institution? Which means, when I say Lutheran missions lead to Lutheran churches, they say, you're just trying to perpetuate an institution. Okay, so we spray John 3:16 out there like a hose and just see what the Holy Ghost does with it. See y'all later. Good luck when you get to trying to write a new Nicene Creed. Institutions need to be reformed. Institutions exist for good. Because when people come together for holy goals, biblical goals, they tend to accomplish goals. That is, the spread of the gospel. We have spent so much money shooting the gospel around and without planting churches. Where is that work now? Where are the converts? Where is the church there? Where is baptism going on? It's not. We are pro-institution. Oh, you're just trying to promote the institution when you maintain that theological education should be overwhelmingly done on site. Well, when you do theological education at a seminary, people actually learn Greek. They learn Hebrew. They might even learn a little Latin and German. I remember sermons in my time by leaders of the church at our seminary saying, now that you're graduating and going into the world, you don't need Greek. You need the newspaper. Ridiculousness, absurdity. Thankfully, I think we're moving past that kind of anti-institutionalism. Seminex was extremely costly for us. It keeps costing us daily in many and various ways. But we are so blessed. We have strong global mission. We've got strong and getting stronger partner churches with challenges here and there. We have united partners globally. We have a Synod convention that voted 94 or 95% to break fellowship with the Japanese Lutheran Church for ordaining women. Can you believe that? A Missouri Synod convention voting 95% against women's ordination. And I would hold that another half of the 5% probably just didn't want to be mean, but don't promote women, wouldn't have women's ordination. Can you imagine a Missouri Synod convention voting 88% for closed communion? We are so blessed. Can you imagine 2 seminaries at this point in the Synod's history to have the kind of leaders we have, Tom Egger and John Bruss? We are so, so blessed. We've got many challenges, but we're blessed. All I want is Book of Concord Lutheranism, folks. The inerrant scriptures. Part of the nonsense that got us going on this was from Edmund Schlink, who otherwise was a fantastic scholar, wrote a great book on the Confessions, but he said, not the authority of the scriptures, but the gospel is the authority. Well, if you actually read the Confessions, over and over again they say that the authority in the church is the divine scriptures. The divine scriptures. Robert Price wrote in a wonderful essay on the power of God, he says, the scriptures participate in all the attributes of God. Eternally true. Divine. Powerful. Able to convert. Eternal. I want Book of Concord Lutheranism. Lutheranism does not need to be supplemented by episcopacy from somebody else. Lutheranism does not need obscure Roman Catholic rites. We're not lacking anything. Lutheranism doesn't need liturgical help from the Anglicans to be what we should be. Book of Concord Lutheranism does not need evangelicalism. I say we may be able to borrow things from any and all those things that are neither commanded or forbidden or might be wise or unwise to use. But my point is, the Book of Concord does not need to be supplemented by infant communion. Book of Concord Lutheranism is what we need. And the Book of Concord tells us who God is very clearly. The Book of Concord says, Article 4, that this is outside of me, extra nos. The gospel comes from outside, and therefore, in order to obtain such faith, Article 5, the office is given. The Book of Concord says the office is from oben, and unten. That is, the office is a divine office. The lips of the pastor are God's lips. The lips of the pastor are God's hands when he speaks and acts. The words of the pastor are God's words, but also from unten. The keys belong to the church. The church chooses a pastor, and God works through the church to call pastors. There is a spiritual priesthood that has all the gifts that they need to speak Christ effectively and savingly to their family, to their neighbors, their co-workers. The Book of Concord teaches that no one should come to the sacrament unless he knows what he seeks or why he comes. The Book of Concord says that these sacraments are signs of confession among men. The Book of Concord says nobody should come to the sacrament unless he has been explored, explorati, and absolved. That's confirmation, especially. And this is our great heritage. Thank you for your prayers for us in the ELS. Thank you for your prayers for us. Our working together with your folks and the Wells people in the last 12 years in conversations has been the highlight of our life. Ecumenically, although you guys don't like to use the word ecumenical. I should say we are unofficially having a unrecorded, marvelous time together. There is no threat of fellowship anytime soon, so don't worry about that. The issues that remain are issues of women's service in the church, boards, voting, that kind of thing, and issues of fellowship, which are very difficult for us. I think we probably have come to the point, most of us, to say that the church and office of the ministry issues should not divide, or should not ultimately divide. If we ever are to get back together, it's going to be completely a divine act of grace. And the Lord can work surprising things, but it's not going to be forced by us or anybody. And just one more thing. The conversations we have with your people, Wells and Els, are, we talk to the Anglicans, the ACNA. We got some more conservative Anglicans we're talking with. They're fun to talk with. We're talking to the NALC, North American Lutheran Church, which broke from the ELCA but kept women's ordination. Nobody compares theologically, knowing the languages, knowing the sources, knowing the history. Nobody compares with Wells and Els, and it's a pleasure. So, thank you for listening to these random and somewhat uncontrolled thoughts. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
We have about 3 or 4 minutes for a question, I'm going to guess. And so I will give...
You want me to talk for 4 more minutes?
No. I will open it up for Dr. Brown and President Ohnberger if they would have a question. Otherwise, we'll turn it to the audience. And you will get an opportunity on Friday to grill him more.
Was it on? Some of my colleagues go to the Lutheran Historical Conference, which is across American Lutheran lines, and sometimes it's their first opportunity to talk with historians from other church bodies. Some of them came back from this meeting saying, it was our impression that the Missouri Synod on the coasts is more liberal than the Missouri Synod in the heartland. Is that an accurate picture?
Well, you know, you have different experiences, different intensities regarding the issues of Seminex, but you have tended to find more a looser practice on communion and other issues historically in those areas. However, I would say, you know, we've got faithful DPs who are responding to me. Anybody who comes to me with an issue of ecclesiastical significance or potential discipline, and I contact a district president about it many times, and I'll just talk about the coasts. They will contact me, telling me the situation. I had a guy from a district that some people would very much poo-poo, came to me, called me while I was in Europe, said he had a situation coming up, that it was an anomaly, it shouldn't have happened, there were apologies for it already. He handled it absolutely perfectly, and he has done that numerous times. Another district president on the coast, a joint Missouri Synod ELCA congregation, he has been working with it. He's handled it. It's taken care of. These happen over and over again. If a pastor, and I haven't heard about it for a long time, if a pastor does a joint Thanksgiving service or something, I'll just call the DP up and say, hey, this happened. He obviously knows that it shouldn't have happened. I just say, remind the brother that he has synodical commitments, and he'll do that. So we follow up, I follow up on every single one, and I get cooperation from all districts, and I would say especially those coastal districts. So you've got some really strong theological brothers in many of those places at this point, so we're thankful.
President Ohnberger, did you have a response? We have Arthur here with a microphone. The first to raise their hand with a question will probably be it. There we go over there, Arthur.
Is it? Oh, good, it is. Okay, I'll work with this. I'm Allie Pettis. I am a senior here at Bethany Lutheran College, and my general just question for the Missouri Synod side is, how did this affect serving pastors at the time? So how did the Seminex and all of these seminarians and professors walking out, how did it affect the other people working within the Missouri Synod already?
Intense trauma and division, just pain. I came to be sympathetic with the Seminex guys for this point when Robert Preuss was removed for causes that I did not believe were just. That hurt. Now, I disagreed with the causes and the theology of Seminex, but I understood the human element. And to have men that you studied under
being publicly charged with heresy, leaving, that is a super traumatic, heart-wrenching event. And I will always have sympathy for them for that reality that the Missouri Synod allowed to get to that point. So.
We are out of time at this point. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. with the next lecture. You are welcome to dine in the cafeteria, but you've got plenty of time if you wish to go elsewhere. Thank you to President Harrison, and we'll see you at 2 p.m.